welcome. Good morning. This is my energy morning. I just spent the last 2 hours with the head of Aramco talking about oil and gas, and now I'm going to come over here and talk with you guys about nuclear, and it's fun. And I'm delighted to have you all here. Thank you very much for coming. I think this is we've been looking forward to this. This is a very important conversation that we need to have between our two countries, and there's a great deal, much larger issues at stake, than just a bilateral relationship between Korea and the United States. A friend of mine who's in the nuclear business recently took a swing through Asia, and he came back and he shared. I just said, "What were your reactions?" He said, "Well, in a post Fukushima environment, all the private conversations with the Japanese were, we know we've got to get it started again, but I don't think we're going to get it started again. All of the conversations with Koreans were, boy, this has made it a lot harder, but we're going to educate the public and we'll stay on the plan. And all the conversations with the Chinese were, we're going to do it, we don't care what they think." Okay, Now, in a way, that is emblematic of the larger issue. If you think about it, that's really emblematic. The Fukushima was a remarkable tragedy. It had honest roots as a natural disaster. There were design problems, obviously, with Fukushima, but it started off as an extraordinary disaster. But it migrated into the third disaster, which was a great crisis of confidence that the government could protect citizens from a technology that they were afraid of and they found frightening. That's really the tragedy now. That's really the lingering crisis in Japan. It's not so much about nuclear energy, but it's a loss of confidence that the government is competent to manage a potentially dangerous technology and keep people safe. This is where I'm quite confident about Korea. I think Korea has very, very strong both technical competence and also oversight. It's essential, if there's going to be a future for nuclear energy, and I think there has to be a future for nuclear energy, the starting point has to be very strong, competent government oversight. I mean, that's got to be the threshold. But there's a larger issue, I think, at play, because in delineating these three attitudes about nuclear, and in China, the attitude is it doesn't really matter, we're going to go ahead and do it. Of course, that's the kind of thinking that brought you a Shinkansen train that had a crash, and the provincial governor tried to bury the train wreckage. That's not quite the kind of attitude you want to run nuclear power plants. Right? And you live right next door. You have as much of an interest, and the Japanese have an interest, I tell this to them, in establishing the highest standards of transparency and safety in the world, because it's the only way we're going to try to get the Chinese to raise their expectations for performance. We're going to have to do that. This is really the larger issue that's at stake. And it's not just a safety of operation, it's also safety from a global standpoint to prevent the diversion into weapons programs of nuclear material. This is a partnership that we have to have together. This is really the core of what we're talking about. And I continue to believe that Korea plays just an indispensable role in this, because Korea sees its future as being one of the few global vendors of nuclear technology and capability. I mean, you have that commitment to do it, and once Koreans decide they're going to do something, they do it. But we need you then to be the standard bearer of the very highest standards of safety and security and operation and proliferation prevention. This, I think, needs to be the backdrop for our thinking about the current debates we're having in closed channels with each other about modifying and extending the 123 agreement. It's a real partnership we now have to have with each other. I think it's been narrowly designed up to this point, and I understand that. But I think it needs to be more broadly scaled. We do want Korea to be successful as a nuclear vendor, to establish these norms. We really want that. But then Korea has to take a larger view of itself, not just what's good for Korea, but what's going to be good in a global sense. Korea needs to think of itself as a global leader on nuclear security, not just a global leader on nuclear power plants. That's really the issue I think we have to be addressing. And that's how we should be thinking about it in the United States. We should be recasting this rather difficult debate we're having with each other right now about 1, 2, 3 into this larger sense. And that's really why we wanted to have this conference. This is why we wanted to do this together. So I really think this is a very important day, and I'm very glad that a very distinguished group of colleagues is willing to do this for us. So thank you all for coming. I'm really glad that you're here. There's an awful lot on the table that's very important. And now I would like to turn to Chairman Ha to offer some real introductory comments and get this started for real. Thank you very much.
Good morning. On behalf of the EAI, I would appreciate for the CSIS nice arrangement of this meeting for the discussion on the ROK U.S. cooperation for global nuclear governance. I believe that today's meeting will contribute to a lot to increasing common understanding of necessity of bilateral nuclear cooperation and also to solving the problems we have at this moment for the future of ROK U.S. nuclear cooperation. For this purpose, we do need a frank and also imaginative dialogue on the following 3 major issues. First major issue is the proliferation aspect of peaceful nuclear cooperation between 2 countries. In spite of continuing efforts of South Korean government to keep the promise of non-proliferation during last several decades, some of us still worry about the marginal potential risk of South Korea's nuclear proliferation in the case of worst scenario on the Korean Peninsula. There is a strong consensus in South Korea that the nuclearization of South Korea will destroy completely its security and prosperity. Thus, we do need a candid and serious discussion on the possible measures of achieving firm trust of South Korea's policy toward non-proliferation. Second major issue is economic aspect of peaceful nuclear cooperation. There are now more than 400 nuclear power plants over the world. In spite of Japan's Fukushima nuclear accident, nuclear market will continuously expand or grow in the next future because of increasing demand of electricity and also the delayed development of alternative energies. For instance, China, having currently 14 nuclear power plants, is now constructing 26 power plants by 2015 and will likely achieve 50 to 60 gigawatts nuclear power capacity by 2020. It means that China will become global number 3 instead of Japan in the capacity of nuclear power. In this rapidly changing situation of nuclear market, South Korea and the United States should also discuss more extensively the possibility of joint efforts to develop nuclear market in the near future. Third point I would like to mention is the technological aspect of peaceful nuclear cooperation between 2 countries. South Korea, as an energy resource poor country, does not have any alternative other than the nuclear energy in the near future. Thus, it will have to develop advanced technology for the nuclear power plants and also nuclear fuel, which can satisfy political and economic requirement of nuclear cooperation between two countries. In this respect, we do need to share ideas how we can achieve this goal. I believe that today's discussions on the three major issues will help not only the future of ROK, U.S. peaceful nuclear cooperation, but also global security and prosperity as a whole. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Ha and Chairman Hamry, for getting us off to a good start this morning. My name is Victor Cha. I'm the Senior Advisor and Korea Chair here at CSIS. Before we begin, I wanted to first recognize a couple of people. First, President Suk-Jung Lee, who it was through her efforts that we came together to put together this conference. So I'm very happy that that this all came about. And then Ambassador Tom Hubbard, who has joined us also, who is on the board of various organizations related to Korea here in the United States. The first panel is on global nuclear governance and U.S. ROK cooperation. Let me introduce the panelists to you before we actually get into the discussion. Speaking first will be Professor Chesong Chun Chesong, who is a professor of political science and international relations at Seoul National University. He also chairs the Asia Security Initiative Research Center at the East Asia Institute and is a member of the Advisory Committee for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Ministry of Unification. He holds an MA from Seoul National as well as a PhD in International Relations Theory from Northwestern University. His research interests include international relations, security studies, South Korean foreign policy, and East Asian security. His recent publications include The Rise of New Powers and the Responding Strategies of Other Countries, Theories of East Asian International Relations, and Is Politics Moral? Niebuhr's Transcendental Realism. Speaking next will be Sung-Ho Sheen. How are you? Good to see you. He is an associate professor in the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. Previously, he was a visiting fellow at the East-West Center and a CNAPS fellow here at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He was also an assistant research professor at the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii and a research fellow at IFPA, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His research interests include international security, U.S. foreign policy, Northeast Asian politics, and the Korean Peninsula. He received his PhD and MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts and his BA from Seoul National University. Speaking after Professor Sheen will be Chaim Braun, who is at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. He is a consulting professor there specializing in issues related to nuclear power, economics, and fuel supply, as well as nuclear non-proliferation. At CSAC, Dr. Braun pioneered the concept of proliferation rings dealing with the implications of the AQCON nuclear technology smuggling ring, the concept of the Energy Security Initiative, or ESI, and on a study of safeguarding the agreed framework in North Korea. Dr. Braun is currently working on an analysis of new nuclear power plants, prospects in the Middle East, and the potential for nuclear proliferation from prospective nuclear plants in industrializing countries. He is a member of the World Nuclear Association, committees on nuclear economics and assured fuel supplies. He is also a permanent lecturer at the World Nuclear University's one-week courses. And then after those presentations, we will have discussion that will be led by Gordon Flake. Gordon Flake, as you all know, is the He runs the Mansfield Foundation here in town. He joined the Mansfield Foundation in February of 1999. Prior to that, he was Senior Fellow and Associate Director of the Program on Conflict Resolution at the Atlantic Council of the United States, and prior to that, Director of Research and Academic Affairs at KEI, the Korea Economic Institute of America. He's traveled to North Korea numerous times. He serves on the board of the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea and the Advisory Council of the Korea Economic Institute. He's a New Mexican, born in Rehoboth, New Mexico. Received his BA in Korean with a minor in International Relations from Brigham Young University in Utah. He also holds an MA from the David Kennedy Center for International Area Studies at Brigham Young University. So it's a very well-qualified panel, and I'm going to stop talking because I want us to just get right into the discussion now. So Professor Chun, if you'd like to start, do you have a PowerPoint presentation? Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cha. Thank you very much for this great opportunity. Also, I thank to the CSIS. I have PowerPoints. It's about 13 pages, so I think I have to stay for a minute per slide, maybe. Today, I want to talk about some general purpose of this project or our project team, how we approach this problem, and then more specifically about the question of the NPT and South Korea's role. Our team is composed of political scientists, nuclear scientists, policy analysts. So it's a very good combination of the specialists in Korea. The purpose of the study is not really specifically about the revision of the bilateral nuclear agreement between the United States and Korea. It's about more general, broader perspective of how we can promote the cooperation between two countries about this regional, global nuclear governance. That's an important wording of how we approach this question. So as President Henry and our Chairman Ha talked about, we want to define the scope and paradigm of future cooperation from a broader perspective, or for the nuclear governance between two countries. So we want to review the problems and challenges of the current nuclear governance from a multi-layered, more comprehensive perspective. And finally, this is a 2-year project, so we want to suggest a roadmap for the implementation stages of cooperation for the future. So there are some elements about this new approach. First one is to broaden the scope of cooperation by combining the area of non-proliferation or national security and nuclear technology industry on the other hand. In South Korea, maybe in the States, there is some division of labor or some separation of two fields, political scientists and non-proliferation specialists on the one hand. On the other hand, there is very complicated technological specialty and economics of the industry. But every elements of nuclear governance have distinct dimensions, political dimensions, economic dimensions, and technological one. So we have to combine them, but also we have to know the specific, the mechanism inside each domain, and then we can combine these three in a more coherent fashion. So we want to cope with rapidly changing nuclear environments, both in security, the national security, not nuclear security, the national security, and also industry. So we have very, rapidly changing environments for this global nuclear governance. Then what will be South Korea's role? These days, South Korea has more roles in many areas of global governance, in nuclear security, G20, financial international regimes, and also other security-related stuff. So there could be some South Korean more broadened role for comprehensive nuclear governance with more responsibility. And we have the task of cultivating proper security and nuclear culture and also perspectives in South Korea. So there are different levels of challenges and scopes of nuclear governance at the global level. North Korea and Iranian attempt to have nuclear weapons. There is growing risk of terrorist theft, which actually led to the establishment of the nuclear security regime from 2010. nuclear accidents as witnessed in Fukushima, and nuclear renaissance. But on the other hand, there is more emphasis on the need to produce electricity from nuclear industry. And there is a new need for export control because we will have more and more power plants all over the world. So at the global level, there is a issues of non-proliferation regime, export control regime, proliferation security initiative, PSI. Actually, it is quite much related to South Korea situations, nuclear security and nuclear safety. So all these three as stuff at the global level. Regional level, there is more complicated political and economic logic in East Asia. Basically, in East Asia, we have the phenomenon of power transition, rise of China, and some relatively weakening of U.S. influence. But these days, U.S. is pursuing the so-called rebalancing strategy in the region. Rapid arms race in East Asia, even after the end of the Cold War. So there is always a risk of nuclear arming in each country in East Asia. And many flashpoints of conflicts, inter-Korean relations, cross-strait relations, Fukushima incident, anti-nuclear movements in Japan. Now it has some impacts on South Korean mass as well. Rising nationalism, which is very endogenous in this region. So we have very, complicated issues at the regional level in East Asia, which is related to regional nuclear governance. Then we have to deal with East Asian non-proliferation, nuclear security and safety issue, reduction and control of nuclear arms. Bilateral level, we have very serious North Korean nuclear problems, which is almost now 20 years old. Inside South Korea, there are some voices for nuclear sovereignty, which is very interesting phenomenon. I will talk about that later. So we have the issue of how to revise and modify bilateral nuclear treaty between two countries, how we can cope with North Korean nuclear problem. We have to strengthen the extended deterrence with the help of the United States. So there could be major areas of bilateral cooperation, as I said, all these things at the very different levels. So we have to broaden the scope if we want to deal with this, nuclear governance at the peninsula level, regional, and global level. And then what will be the challenges for South Korean new approach? South Korea, these days, South Koreans try to define themselves as some middle power citizens. It is about more responsibility, more working for some kind of universal values. So there is for this specific issue, there is more need for dialogue and coordination inside South Korea between non-proliferation and strategy area and nuclear technology and industry. So as I'm a political scientist, but as I do this research, I learned a lot, and I felt the more need to have a linkage between these different areas. But because nuclear governance is very complex area, not just for study but also for policy making. We have North Korean nuclear problems, and they continue to develop nuclear programs, and we have to have a very strong stance of deterrence. But we have to refrain from any kind of nuclear armaments, as Chairman Ha just mentioned. So we have this specific issue. But also there are different opinions on nuclear energy. There is a strong supporters of nuclear energy. There is also anti-nuclear movements among the general public. Sovereign rights, ROK-US relations. So first thing we have to do is to differentiate in a political approach for national sovereignty from a more rational approach for economic profit and technological development. So some people confuse these two dimensions, political dimensions and more economic and technological dimensions. Professor Chun Bong-gun here, who is a presenter in the afternoon session, he has a very interesting and very helpful division of the public in 4 approaches to full cycle debate. This is an example. So there are 4: sovereign-based approach, pragmatic approach, anti-fuel cycle, full cycle approach, anti-nuclear approach. These 4, maybe there are more, or there is some combination of these approaches. Sovereign-based approach, they support the full cycle. They think that security, this is wrong. This is sovereignty first approach. Sorry, pragmatic approach. They think that negotiation is necessary, and they think energy security is the most important. Anti-full cycle approach, they oppose full cycle, but they think that alliance with the United States and non-proliferation is most important. Anti-nuclear, from a progressive side, they oppose anything actually about nuclear energy. They think environment is the first. So there are very divergent, different opinions about nuclear energy, how we can continue to develop nuclear industry. So we have to enlighten South Korean way of defining national interests from the perspective of middle power in the future. So we see some changes in South Korean foreign policy. Weak power nationalism, well, that tends to put more emphasis on sovereignty, for example. But now we think that South Korea is becoming more about middle power. So we have middle power kind of nationalism with some concerns about universal values. We can say there is a combination between nationalism and some kind of cosmopolitanism. Still, it's growing. We don't know, but I can say that it's growing. They're moving from peninsula-focused approach to more regional and global-oriented strategy in nuclear governance. From rule follower to more architectural partner with proper inputs. So these words are for about general direction South Korea's foreign policy. Maybe there's normative view, but as a weak power, we just participated in as a rule follower. But now we try to be more participating and more active by having more universal kind of perspectives. From narrowly interest-based approach to more responsibility-oriented approach. So this is about the general approach of this project and for my article. For the latter part, I have just several slides of NPT. Then how we apply this kind of approach when we talk about the problem of NPT, a non-proliferation regime which started in 1968. Well, it has a lot of problems, existing multilateral institutions, including NPT, Nuclear Suppliers Group, and all the things, they have failed to prevent states such as India, Pakistan, and North Korea from going nuclear and ill-equipped to check these countries. And also Iran, we have Iranian problem. Recent cases such as Libya, now they dismantled all the nuclear programs. We still have problems with Iran and North Korea. But these cases have been dealt with by direct bilateral government-to-government negotiations rather than, depending on to NPT, or ad hoc forums of interested parties such as six-party talks. In the case of North Korea and P5+1 grouping for Iran. Also, so that's the biggest, problems in NPT. We have very weak regime, weak design to prevent any country from going nuclear. But also, there is a issue of the universality gap. There is a strong complaints from non-nuclear weapon states that this is not fair because we have three pillars in NPT, and we have some, self-contradictory trend. Well, we can harmonize that, but still we have some problems in implementation stages. With the potential renaissance of nuclear energy, claims from non-nuclear weapon states with a matter of compliance of non-nuclear weapons with NPT obligations, they think that they are unfairly blocked from the peaceful use of energy by the nuclear weapon states. So there is some debate, also, there is some counter arguments from nuclear weapon states as well. But we see when we confine our discussion in the bilateral cooperation between U.S. and South Korea, we are very much interested in how U.S. can sustain its leadership under this very difficult environment. So we can list some questions for U.S. leadership. So how can the United States maintain the leadership in the global nuclear governance, which will be very crucial to the efforts of non-proliferation worldwide? How can we maintain our regime or security from terrorists? And also the U.S. economic interest. How can U.S. deal with the claims and complaints of other followers, especially nuclear weapon states. Because some states criticize the lack of U.S. leadership in creating regional peace. So how can U.S. revive its general role of security guarantor in several regions? I'll speak very fast. With rising economic and technological powers of rising states, in the area of energy production and export, how can the United States, with declining commercial capability, maintain its economic interest and force the inalienable standard of non-proliferation? So the main question for me is, who will be the best partners for the revitalization of U.S. leadership in the area of global nuclear governance with common values and high-level competence? So this is the last part, South Korea's role for NPT. There are some worries I saw in these states as North Korea develops more and more the nuclear weapons and nuclear programs. South Korea may think about nuclear armaments, but it's totally wrong. Actually, South Korea became the victim for weak NPT regime because North Korea took advantage of the loopholes of NPT. And South Korea had a learning effect of enhancing its national interests by contributing to global regime, especially with strategic cooperation with the U.S. and also with very general multilateral regimes. The question is how to prevent the cases of exploiting the NPT regime, like in the case of North Korea. They acquired all the necessary technologies inside NPT and they just leave it. Then we have very serious problems. So South Korea and U.S., there should be joint efforts of engagement. But non-proliferation, the phenomenon of non-proliferation is the end result, not just from a technological efforts, but also a political approach as well. So we have political and technological dimension in maintaining non-proliferation. So in dealing with North Korean problems, this is a broader question, but U.S. and South Korea, maybe from the next year, we have to make a joint efforts how to engage with North Korea to make them completely, give up all the nuclear programs, which will be very hard challenges. Because North Korea's the basic motivation is political one. They want to survive under, they think, very hostile environments after the end of Cold War. So proliferation is directly related to political questions. But South Korea and United States, by developing a common approach, it's very hard, but still we have to do that. So we can mend the loopholes of the proliferation by complementing with this kind of political approach as well. Also, there is another big problem. Non-nuclear weapon states and non-alignment states, they stress their rights for peaceful use of nuclear energy. That's also is related issue to South Korea as well. So we want to enhance our peaceful use of nuclear energy without the danger of having any kind of proliferation related end result. So lastly, South Korea and the United States can cooperate to find out new ways to develop proliferation-resistant nuclear energy production, which may be directly related to the more specific issues about, the 1-2-3 agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chae-sung. And speaking next will be Professor Sheen on the U.S. ROK Alliance and Non-Proliferation Cooperation.
Thank you, Dr. Cha. Professor John laid out a very general background about this U.S. ROK or ROK-U.S. 1-2-3 agreement. And I will just also briefly talk about what might be the key issue in terms of, in the context of managing the alliance. First, the thing is the growing role of South Korea in terms of U.S. ROK alliance has been all about Korean Peninsula so far. But under the, especially the current administration, Lee Myung-bak administration, South Korea tried to define its role within the ROK-U.S. alliance just not only on Korean Peninsula and beyond Korean Peninsula. So we have thing called like strategic alliance. But actually the thing is, what do we mean by strategic alliance? And there was some kind of question and soul searching about what will be the defining character of this strategic alliance of ROK-US over the past years. And there are some cases. And one thing is that it reflects the growing role and possible potential of South Korea within the broad national security framework of U.S. Security interests beyond the Korean Peninsula. And that is because of, as I laid out in here, in general, the Korea's growing role in the world stage, G20, Nuclear Security Summit, economic growth, and vibrant democracy, and all that. Yet at the same time, another one key reason might be the growing importance of Asia, in particular, to China in the U.S. security, strategy. And if U.S.-China relation is getting more and more attention, the Korean Peninsula obviously is one of the key spots in that bilateral key relationship in the 21st century. And another element is it might be kind of temporary thing, but so far at the moment, suddenly shrinking role or will from Japan as a key partner for the United States, at least in East Asia Pacific, under this current Japanese government leadership. So this, by and large, elevates Korea's role within the broad U.S. alliance partnership, not only in East Asia, but even maybe at the global level. And I think, so as a result, one thing we have noticed over the past years is that the U.S. ROK-US alliance has been at its best, according to someone, is never been better. But that at the moment, key question is now we have, again, the leadership change, but non-change in the United States. President Obama re-elected, but we are still having a new election in South Korea right now. And what next? What will be the case? Will it be, again, the best alliance partnership in the next another 4 or 5 years? Here, I see there might be some challenges because we may have to deal with quite difficult issues between the two countries. And one is this 123 agreement, revision of atomic energy partnership coming in this 2014. But there is also some other issue. I mean, depending on who will become the next leader of South Korea, there is some discussion. Maybe some new leadership may want to renegotiate U.S.-Korea FTA, not the whole thing, but some part of it. Anyway, that can cause some trouble right next from the very beginning of a new administration in Korea. But again, this nuclear partnership. At the same time, we also have this, delayed transition of wartime operational control. These are set to be resolved by 2015, along with ongoing this U.S. ROK alliance restructuring. That is that relocation of Yongsan bases and Osan Pyeongtaek. It is still going on, and it's not done there. And in fact, with the difficult economic situation in both United States and South, in fact, in the next administration, this issue also will become quite challenges, as both tries to maybe save some money in who will pay for how much in terms of ROK-US alliance restructuring. So these are some kind of challenges that the two new government may have on the next administration, and among that, obviously, this ROK-US 123 agreement. That is one thing. But at the same time, this also ROK-US 123 agreement can provide not only the challenge, but it could become a new opportunity. In Korean words, wigi means always there is a challenges, but at the same time, it could become opportunity. That is that if the two governments handles this issue very wisely, it could set up a new kind of stepping stone for this really two bilateral partnership to elevate its partnership not only in terms of Korea-U.S. bilateral issue, but at the regional and global level. That I think has to do with South Korea's growing capacity and role in nuclear energy field. That is, yes, this ROK-US 123 agreement is basically about how to manage this nuclear partnership at the bilateral level, but it has also regional and global implication, as Professor John just laid out. Two things. One is that the original agreement was made 40 years ago, when South Korea was literally just beginning its nuclear program. In that sense, our capacity was almost basically nothing. But after 40 years right now, South Korea is the sixth largest nuclear energy producer in the world with 23 nuclear reactors. And of course, growing role and almost complete capacity, and maybe even best capacity in building nuclear power plant, running the nuclear capacity. And eventually now even we have become an exporter of this nuclear power plant after UAE agreement. So that is one thing. Yet at the same time, yes, the other thing is after Fukushima, right now, not only Japan, but even Germany, which is another very big power in the nuclear energy sector, they decide almost to shut down all their nuclear power plant. That means what? Suddenly South Korea will become really important nuclear energy player in this very important field. So not only it's not only about the growing capacity of South Korea under this U.S. ROK bilateral agreement, but also South Korea suddenly become emerging as an important player in nuclear energy field for the United States. And of course, the issue of China is different. But anyway, so it means there's a kind of great potential for South Korea to play certain role, not only the bilateral level, but in the regional and global level. So one of the key aspects of this coming agreement between the two governments is for the United States to recognize the growing capacity and the role and even the potential of South Korea to play the key element in this not only nuclear energy field, but the U.S. agenda about the nuclear security as well. So that is, I think, one key issue about this. But it's not only about the United States. I think the South Korea also has to take certain responsibility, as Professor John said. South Korea should not think this is only in terms of bilateral issue. This also has obviously regional and global implications. So South Korea also has to take definitely certain step to take more responsibility and more positive role in this global nuclear security area. So both governments need to first recognize there is a new potential and area that these two governments need to work on together. So we should not narrow it down our focus into this is just as a bilateral issue. If we just focus on this as a bilateral issue, there will be a good possibility that this could become another test case for the alliance in the next coming years. And that's the last thing the both governments wants at the moment. So in that sense, again, and one recent development in South Korea, for example, is that we, along with this hosting of nuclear security summit, so far South Korea was all about nuclear energy. In fact, it is true that South Korea didn't really care much about nuclear security and non-proliferation regime, but in 2011, for the first time, South Korea enacted a nuclear security law as a domestic legislation. And we also established nuclear security committee for the first time in our, before then it was all about how to promote nuclear energy. But this is not because nuclear security summit or US concern. Actually, this has grown out of a very natural phenomenon in South Korea that Korean public is also becoming increasingly aware of the importance of nuclear safety issue. So there is also South Korean push factor that we need to also pay more attention about this other side of nuclear energy. So in that sense, again, there's a great potential for this bilateral partnership in nuclear energy sector. And I think this coming new revision of agreement should really play a kind of important, the two governments has to take this as a new opportunity rather than new challenge to upgrade its bilateral partnership, not only in terms of so Korea's nuclear energy demand, but also the regional and global nuclear safety issue, nuclear security issue, and nuclear non-proliferation issue. Thank you so much.
Okay, and our next speaker is Professor Braun.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I think I'll give it up and speak just from my seat. I'm very happy that I'm speaking after my two Korean colleagues, because while they highlighted various issues and indicated that we need to find some solutions, I come down the scale into more specific suggestions that offer some specific avenues for cooperation in the near term, both on a bilateral and on a regional basis. So while they highlighted the need for some possible solutions, I will come up with suggestions of what some of those solutions might be. Again, these are only solutions. I'll talk about bilateral issues and regional issues. As regards regional issues, I want to make sure that we understand that I'm not talking about a unique solution, but I want to highlight unique problems. If you understand the problems, eventually we find the most appropriate solution for the problems. So let me just start. On the bilateral issues, what I want to make or suggest here does not in any way conflict with the 123 agreement. It doesn't prejudice its results, and for all we know, it may even enhance the result of the discussions, whichever way the outcome might come out. With that, let me say that the first idea that I have in mind has to do with enrichment. Of course, the Republic of Korea wants to get more into enrichment as befits its large capacity of nuclear energy in order to guarantee the supply of its fuel. On the other end, the United States government position is that it was not interested in spreading out enrichment technology all over the world. So how to bridge the gap between these two positions, and eventually some solution will come out of in the 123 agreement, but even before that there are some steps that could be done by the Korean side and the American side to improve or enhance cooperation in this area. What could be done is that the government of Korea, in consultation with the United States and through actions of the involved companies, could support the United States Enrichment Corporation, USEC, or could support the plant that USEC is now building, the Advanced Centrifuge Plant, ACP. Both the ACP plant in particular and USEC more in general require financial help because of various reasons. Korea, which is interested in getting more into the enrichment business, could provide some funding support either for the ACP directly or for USEC more in general to help get a share in the activity or in the commercial activity of USEC as a company or the ACP plant as an enrichment venture. This share will be in the context of commercial share and not technology cooperation share. Such particular participation in the commercial side of an enrichment plant are a common practice in the enrichment world. There are several examples of this. In France, the Eurodiff plant has got 3 partners, Spain, Italy, and Switzerland, I think. There was a Sophie-Diff plant, which was Iran and France, which of course was cancelled. Kazakhstan is a 30% owner of a Russian enrichment plant. Hitachi and Cameco, a Canadian company, are partners in the General Electric Laser Enrichment Corporation. And of course, Korea is a partner in the French enrichment plant, Eurodiff, the new plant that is built. Korea took a 3% equity stake to guarantee its uranium supply. Along the same way, Korea might consider taking even a larger equity stake either in USEC or in the ACP plant and become a partner in the United States Enrichment Corporation operations. This will give Korea a chance to understand how the enrichment plant works. It will give it guarantee for future supplies should it purchase more uranium from the ACP plant and from USEC in general. It will bring it more into the general framework of operating enrichment plants, and it will support later joint Korean-American power plant bids that will include cradle-to-grave supply of services, including joint supply of enrichment services from a plant whose ownership would be partially Korean and partially American. So there are some advantages to doing it that way. On the back end of the fuel cycle now, there's the issue of spent fuel storage. Of course, we know that the Korean government is interested in pyroprocessing, but there is a problem of spent fuel accumulated in power plants that needs to find a solution. Korea is developing now, in cooperation with the United States, a pyroprocessing technology, or at least it's studying it. But it seems to me that the issue of pyroprocessing, including eventual commercialization, is a 20 to 25 year solution, whereas we have a 10 to 15 years problem. So evidently, pyroprocessing will not solve all the problems that exist in the field, and something else needs to be done. Of course, Korea is interested in getting the right to do reprocessing into the 123 agreement. The United States has a different position in general regarding enrichment and reprocessing technologies. So how to square the circle in this case? Well, what I have in mind is to suggest the possibility of at least demonstrating, and make sure that we are clear, I'm talking only about demonstrating spent fuel storage in Korea without commitment. I'm saying this as an idea of enhancing the flexibility of the Korean spent fuel management solution options rather than committing the Korean government to any one course or another. However, if the Korean government will get into learning how spent fuel could be managed through centralized dry cask storage program through a demonstration plant only, it will give it an option, should it want to exercise it in the future, of taking some of the spent fuel from the power plants where there's no space for them anymore and moving them into a centralized storage facility, should it want to build a centralized storage facility in the future. But in the meantime, until there is a decision that's going to be made one way or another, it might be to the advantage of the Korean government to learn through a demonstration project how spent fuel could be managed in a centralized storage facility in Korea through a specialized demonstration project, which is what I'm advertising, what I'm suggesting here. Building a small demonstration plant, which will involve a concrete pad, 8 or 10 casks of concrete with spent fuel in canisters and placed in them, and instrumenting the whole thing and measuring how it behaves over time, will not commit the Korean government to one solution or another, but it will teach it, and it will teach the industry, and it will teach the regulators in Korea how to build, license, and operate a future dry cask storage facility, should a decision be made to operate such facility in the future in parallel or instead of, depending on how the situation exists, a pyroprocessing plant. So my idea here is to increase the flexibility field of the Korean government in learning about spent fuel storage rather than committing the government to any one solution or another. A third option that I want to discuss has to do with advanced reactors. The Korean government is now selling advanced reactors to United Arab Emirates. It's now in strong negotiations to sell similar reactors to Turkey, and it's interested in selling reactors to other countries. Korean government is also interested in enhanced cooperation in the United States in this area, and we know, on the other hand, that Westinghouse is now partnering with Korean companies in the United Arab Republic, and Korean equipment manufacturers are supplying components for Westinghouse plants, AP1000 plants, that are built in the United States. So some level of cooperation already exists and should continue to exist in the future, and the more the better. However, there are ways to enhance the cooperation in this area, and this involves more than just cooperation-to-cooperation agreements on a case-by-case basis. The trend right now in nuclear plant bids is to provide a bid for a whole range of services, what we call cradle-to-grave services, which include reactor sale, fuel cell for a portion of the lifetime, operators training, support in maintenance and modifications, and all the way to support in spent fuel management, if possible. In this context, there is room for enhanced cooperation through government support between the United States and Korea, and to corporate cooperation in enhancing the joint scope of cradle-to-grave joint bids by American and Korean corporations. Some of it could be done through government-to-government discussions. That's always the starting point. And based on that, enhanced discussion between power plants or between utilities and between vendors in Korea and in the United States could take place on hand to enhance cooperation in building conventional light water reactor to joint bids in the world at large. In addition, the Korean government is now interested in advanced reactors, in particularly seeing that the Korean government is now interested in pyroprocessing. Pyroprocessing is not just an end, it's a means to something else. And one of the something else that will come out of it are breeder reactors of various shapes. Now, Korea is a relative, and I'm saying relative, novice to the area of fast reactor development. The United States has a long experience in fast reactor development, extending over more than 60 years. Korean experience is limited, and I should say 10 to 20 years duration of a smaller scope. So evidently there is a scope for cooperation between American corporations and Korean corporations. In particular, there are two American designs now that might be of interest to the Korean government. One of them is the General Electric, what we call Super Prism LMR, which has been developed as a mainline United States breeder reactor concept and been developed in General Electric, been developed in Argonne National Laboratory, and that's a major breeder design that's built in the United States. It requires an external fuel cycle facilities, but it's way farther along the development path. The other option is the traveling wave reactor that's developed, interestingly, by Microsoft Corporation people. That's a new way of doing nuclear weapon design that never existed before, but it's very interesting nonetheless. That's a reactor that does not require any external fuel cycle facilities, and therefore it's very easy to operate because it does not require external fuel cycle. On the other end, the material development issues here are rather complex. So it seems that there is scope for cooperation here. Should pyroprocessing work out as Korea hopes, and it may be settled through the negotiations of the 123 agreement, then Korea might help General Electric through fuel cycle facilities developed through the pyroprocessing system in commercializing a complete system of reactor and external fuel cycle facilities as a package. On the other end, the traveling wave reactor requires technical support for its development, and it might be possible that Korea might have some technical capability to support the TerraPower Corporation developing the travel wave reactor in solving some of the material problems which are on the way to a final commercialization of the traveling wave reactor. So in either way, there is a scope for cooperation that should be pursued from the companies on Generation 4 reactors. Now, the United States has now started a whole new area of development, which is called small and medium power reactors, SMRs. SMRs are something of great interest to the United States by way of getting back into the nuclear business in the United States, as well as also sort of other advantages in the United States proper. There is not clear that there is a market for small and medium power reactor world over, because if anyone wants to build a small and medium power reactor right now, they could go to China, they could go to Korea, not to Korea. Actually, they could go to Korea too. They could go to India, and they could go to Canada and build a small and medium power reactor. However, I don't see much demand for this. Nobody is asking for it. On the other end, the United States is developing a new generation of particularly super safe reactors that might, in the time climate that we are now after Fukushima, find eventually some clients interested in them. And we are talking not about small reactors that fit smaller development grid. We are talking about reactors close to the load centers, and we are talking potentially of reactors that could fill more missions than just supply electricity, among them the provision of water desalination, district heating, and so on. And in this context, I should mention the smart reactor that developed in Korea, which is a small reactor, 100 megawatt, that designed to provide both electricity and water desalination. To that extent, it's a unique reactor concept right now in the world, and it enhances the role of nuclear energy to provide energy services beyond the supply of electric power only, which has been the dream of nuclear energy developers in the world over many years, and that's one of the first examples of trying to bring it into fruition. Evidently, the United States is developing the technology, Korea has got its own unique technology, and there is a scope for cooperation. What could be done here? First of all, the United States has now put out to the Department of Energy a large request for proposal for small reactor development to joint partnership between the government and the industry vendor teams that will win the bid. It might be possible for Korea to government discussions to put more money into the project and become a co-participant or co-manager of the project together with the Department of Energy, should Korean authorities and the U.S. Department of Energy agree to this approach. Beyond that level, Korea could consider taking equity stakes in some of the companies now bidding for this particular project and become partners in corporations developing small and medium power reactors. At the lower level, Korea could try to become a qualified supplier of components for small and medium power reactor components. And as you know, Korea now is a major supplier of components for large reactors, and there's no reason why it could not be a supplier of components for smaller reactors, and it might as well be able to do it even at a lower price than American corporations. So there's a scope for cooperation here. There's a further scope for cooperation in eventually proposing cradle-to-grave ideas or bids for small reactors, which will include both Korean and American participation, and all this could extend more and more into the future. It will all require government-to-government discussions, and corporate-to-corporate support, and eventually some funding for joint projects. So that's all I could say about bilateral issues. I'd like to quickly mention two longer-term regional issues. And again, as I said before, I don't offer unique solutions, but I want to highlight two specific problems. The first problem I want to highlight is the issue of the Korean reactor, North Korean reactor, the DPRK Yongbyon reactor. That's a 25 megawatt reactor, 100 megawatt thermal reactor that is now being built in North Korea, and it's about to start operation in about 2 to 3 years. The reactor has been now closed, the whole buildings are now in place, work is now proceeding inside the buildings. We don't see anything that happened inside. We have no idea how they are building it. We don't know how safe the construction is. We have no idea what their operating philosophy is. We have no idea how good their suppliers are. We know that they have a regulatory agency, but we have no idea how competent it is, let alone how independent it is of the government agencies in Korea, and what level of regulation and licensing support it could provide to the North Korean reactors once it gets into practice. All we know is that North Korea is not a member of any global self-support organization. It's not a member of WANO, the World Association of Nuclear Operators. It's not a member of the IAEA. It does not participate in any international nuclear control agreement. In short, while they can copy everything they read in the books, they don't talk with people, they don't know how reactors really work, and when it comes to the art thing that has to do with people talking, thank you very much, rather than reading from the papers, they simply don't have access. And the question is, now that they'll start operate the reactor, how to make sure that the reactor operates in a safe mode and doesn't cause any problem to potential accident either to North Korea or to North Korea's neighbors, South Korea and China, or to the entire region of Northeast Asia, or to the global nuclear industry as a whole, should a major accident occur there. So there is a problem in the North Korean reactor in that it's a black hole reactor so far as we know. We don't know how to regulate it, but we need to bring it into the global safety regime as it exists all over the world. How could we do it? Evidently, we have to go to the six-party talks. We cannot propose anything with North Korea without that mechanism, but we still need to find a way of making some kind of a solution to how to operate the reactor in a safe mode. And in that context, I had a suggestion. My suggestion was to try and find what is called twining, combining the North Korean plant with a power plant in one of the neighboring countries, so that both plants could do peer review of each of those stations, or plant-to-plant inspections on a confidential basis, only between the plant operators, exchanging safety ideas between each power plant, exchanging best practices, and doing confidential, no-holds-barred discussion. This is how you do it right, this is how you're doing wrong, we suggest you improve here, we suggest you improve there, again on a confidential rather than release basis, so as not to embarrass anyone and not to cause anybody, God forbid, a loss of face or anything. The purpose is to improve safety, not to name names or shame people. So who could support this? There could be a twining between possibly a South Korean plant and the DPRK reactor. There could be twining between a Chinese reactor, which will be built not far from North Korea, and there are several of those, either built or considered, and the North Korean reactors, or any other reactor. But there need to be some kind of a mechanism of proposing a twining agreement between the North Korean reactor and a reactor somewhere else, so that both of these reactor stations could compare notes, and it will be possible to educate the North Korean operators on how to operate safely the reactors, and it will be possible for other people to come into the North Korean reactor station, see how it works, and propose ways to improve its operation and make sure that it operates safely. So this is so far as I could say about the North Korean reactor. This is, by the way, a concept which is called an ABAC-type solution, where two power plants support each other. And this has been tried in South Africa, and it worked. Over there, it was an issue of safeguards. Here, it's the same concept, but applied to safety rather than safeguards. If you generalize from there, we could go to the entire East Sea or Japan Sea, depending on which side of the sea you look at it. And that inland sea is essentially the most heaviest nuclearized sea in the world. 3 of the largest nuclear stations in the world are located on the shores of this sea. In Japan, there's the Kashiwazaki Kariwa station, which is the largest nuclear station in the world. In Korea, there are the Kori and Ulchin plants. Each of them, once that will reach full capacity, it will be more than 8,000 megawatt. Again, the second and third largest plants in the world, all in one country. which 50 years ago did not have any nuclear energy. And we want to make sure that all the plants in that area operate safely. Now we know that there are safety issues and culture issues that have to do with the Japanese plants. Recently there were small safety issues that have to do with Korean plants, and we really want to make sure that nothing happens in Korea that, God forbid, will resemble what happens in Japan, but 20 years later. So we want to make sure that Korean plants continue on the right path rather than diverge to whatever happened in Japan. The issue in Japan is not just break in confidence between the government and the utilities, it's the way the utilities operate each other. The Japanese utilities have got some twining arrangement, and they talk to each other and they compare notes, except they do it in public. And once they do it in public, it's mutual support organization. Everybody is patting each other's shoulder and basically telling each other, oh, you're doing a great job, we are doing a great job, everything is safe, the public shouldn't worry. That's a great approach, but it doesn't get into the problem. What really needs to be done is that we have a one system that exists in paper in all of Northeast Asia, but it's not very active. It needs to be activated. How to activate it? Japan is trying to develop its own American model, which is called INPO. Korea might consider something similar, but altogether it might be possible to do an around the East Sea or around Japan Sea multi-power plant kind of a safety inspection regime, which will be essentially what one should have been doing but has not been doing until now. It needs to be done, and it might be opportune time for Korea to sponsor or to suggest such a mechanism whereby Korean, Japanese, eventually maybe Chinese, eventually maybe even Russian plants, could come together and do plant by plant, confidential rather than public, safety inspections, checking out performance, and conveying best practices from one power plant to another. I call it the East Sea ABAC model, except it will be much larger ABAC because ABAC involves two plants, one in Korea, one in Argentina, one in Brazil. Here we are talking about a large number of power plants, much larger in size, but the principle is the same. However, we need to do something to enhance the safety culture all across East Asia, and those plants are mostly located on the East Sea, and there's room for scope to doing a sub-1 optimized sub-region to take care of the problem. So these are my suggestions. I suggested several things that have to do with bilateral issues in Korea. They have to do in the United States, that have to do with the front end and the back end of the fuel cycle, that have to do with reactors, have to do with Generation 3 reactors, Generation 4 fast breeder reactors, and small and medium power reactors. And I mentioned also regional cooperation that has to do with safety issues, Yongbyon reactor, and all the reactors in Northeast Asia. All this needs to be taken care of. Should they be taken care of, it will help the power plants, it will help the nuclear industry in the region, and it will help the safety acceptance of nuclear power in the region and help nuclear power the world over. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Three excellent presentations, and now we will begin the discussion period, and leading us off in the discussion will be Gordon Flake, Executive Director of the Mansfield Foundation. Gordon, three really interesting papers.
Oh, indeed, and I'm honored to be on this panel and have a chance to comment on them. This panel seems to me to be all about context. It's taking an issue which in most of the media reports for the last several years have focused kind of very narrowly on technical issues between the U.S. and the ROK broadly or bilaterally, and focused on kind of influences that come from the region, from the peninsula, from the broader international regimes, and then vice versa, impacts of decisions that were made in Korea on those, again, the region, the peninsula, the broader national regime. So it's very, very helpful in that regard. Let me just go through the papers individually, make some initial comments, raise some questions, then I'll make some summary comments and wrap up there. Starting with Professor Junjae Zhang's paper, I thought this paper did an excellent job of placing the debate on the U.S. ROK nuclear cooperation into the broader context of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, into the broader context of the overall international nuclear safeguards regime. I think he wisely didn't shy away from the inherent tensions that exist in the NPT and that exist in the broader international relations regime. And I think it's useful to kind of put those out on the table to recognize that there are tensions. There's the tensions between the questions of fairness on the one hand, and on the other hand, stability and risk mitigation on the other, right? So on the one hand, to have an agreement that has haves and haves not is fundamentally unfair, and yet the alternative is fundamentally less stable. It's more difficult to kind of to guarantee safety or mitigate risk. And so to kind of lay that out on the table and help put the U.S. ROK negotiations in that context was very helpful. One of the key questions that I would ask Dr. Jun to think about, which would be very useful I think for our discussion today and for your project, is to discuss more directly how that tension is articulated in Korea. In other words, there is a broad tension between questions of fairness, right? Questions of equal treatment of sovereign nations and national interests as expressed in reinforcing global standards, norms, and regimes, which then have reciprocal benefits for Korea as well. And my feeling is that that is a debate that is not had very openly in the South Korean public yet. It leans heavily in one direction. And so I would just kind of like to hear a little bit more from you how that fundamental underlying tension that you identified is articulated in Korea and how it should be articulated in Korea going forward. I thought it was very interesting in his opening remarks how Dr. Hamry was talking about Korea's tremendous success recently, its expansion recently to the realm of becoming a nuclear exporter. But then he calling for Korea to take a step beyond becoming a global exporter and rather being kind of a leader in reinforcing those kind of broader international regimes. And so this is kind of an underlying question that comes in there too. Depending on what happens in the next year or two, and depending on which direction Korea goes, is Korea and the Korean nuclear program something that threatens or weakens the international regime, and the NPT, or is Korea's actions, a la host of the Nuclear Security Summit, kind of, best practices, transparency, something that strengthens the international regime? And that kind of goes back to the question I was asking Dr. Chun about, how does Korea see its role vis-a-vis the international regime? Is something that is challenging it, challenging those fundamental underlying tensions, or supporting the regimes and structures that exist right now, or perhaps seeking some type of a change that's not existing right now at this point. I would also point out that I found it very useful, and it's a point of debate that's not made very often, what Dr. Chun Jae-sung pointed out, that the ROK right now is one of the clearest victims of existing weaknesses in the NPT regime. If you look at the tremendous opportunity cost over the last 2 decades that South Korea has had to face because dealing with North Korea's nuclear problem, just ask yourself the question, if North Korea did not have a nuclear crisis, where would the Korean Peninsula be today? What would the Korean Peninsula look like today? What would North Korea look like today? And think of all the consequences in the last 20 years in terms of North Korean famine and human costs and human rights. And if you extrapolate on further in terms of the security costs of South Korea. And so those are not unrelated to the North Korean nuclear program. And the North Korean nuclear program is not unrelated to failures in the NPT in terms of how North Korea was able to get where it was to have a nuclear breakout scenario. And so, again, I think it's very useful. I'm not sure how widely articulated that is, but to point out that South Korea is a victim of a weak NPT. Whereas much of the debate in the last year and in the coming years focusing as South Korea as being a victim being held back by efforts to strengthen the NPT. So it's a very interesting dynamic and debate being put forward going forward. The final point I'll make on Dr. Chun's paper, and I thought it was very useful how he pointed out how you really can't talk about the NPT or the broader international nuclear safety and control regimes without putting them in the context of bilateral U.S. ROK alliance, extended deterrence, other regional mechanisms, because often we tend to break these things down and look at them rather atomistically, and you really can't. I mean, the question of South Korea's security, cannot be understood by looking at only one aspect alone, but rather the broadness. And I thought the paper did a very good job of making that very clear. Moving on, if I could, to Dr. Shin Sung-ho's paper. Again, I thought a very useful, helpful paper. This paper in particular did an excellent job of introducing the extra layer of complexity that is due to North-South issues, due to the North Korean nuclear program. So a couple of the questions that kind of came up in myself reading Dr. Shin's paper was, does the ROK agree that enrichment or reprocessing would itself violate the 1992 North-South Denuclearization Accord? In Dr. Shin's paper, he quoted an unnamed American official as saying it would, but I'm curious about a South Korean perspective. Do South Koreans perceive, many of the items we're discussing in the 123 agreement coming up, be it enrichment, be it pyroprocessing, being reprocessing, as violations of the 92 Accord? Related to that, number two, do South Koreans regard the 92 nuclear accord as dead? Again, I thought it was very interesting. Dr. Shin made it clear how complex this issue is. On the one hand, at the face of it, the 1992 denuclearization accords between North Korea and South Korea are kind of moot, right? I mean, North Korea has broken them 10 times over. It's been a long time since anyone's given any real serious credence to them. And yet, as Dr. Shin points out, in the September 19, 2005 joint statement of the six-party talks, which we all adhere to, it restated our commitment to that deal. And so, again, Dr. Sheen did a very good job of explaining how this issue can't be seen as a vacuum. There are second and third order effects, spill-out effects of how they do it. And I'm kind of curious if you would go into a little bit more detail into that agreement. Secondly, on Dr. Shin's paper, I fully agree that the most important challenge for the United States and the ROK on this broad issue that we'll be discussing today is to make sure that this does not become a test case for the alliance. In other words, that it doesn't become overly politicized. Because this is dangerous territory, there's no question. Because this is one of these issues, and again, going back to Dr. John's paper, where this is not an ROK-only issue. There's a fundamental global question of fairness and respect that's embodied in this. But as long as these issues become couched in a question of fairness and treatment and sovereignty, they become increasingly difficult to resolve. And so over the summer, there was a series of newspaper articles in the Chosun Ilbo that were entirely casting a whole range of issues in that light. And they started with the new missile guidelines negotiations, which just wrapped up in October. Now, I don't know if many of you followed that issue, but the response from the United States and the response from the arms control community and China and North Korea and Japan was universally negative, right? The expansion, the unnecessary, dangerous, provocative expansion of South Korean missile ranges. Why do we do this, right? But from my perspective, it was a very positive development because if you understand the political dynamic in Korea right now, these issues are all related. There's a common narrative, again, of respect, of recognizing South Korea's accomplishment, of fair treatment vis-a-vis other countries, and had the relatively less important new missile guidelines deal gone bad, and it became more of a political hot potato in South Korea, the spillover effect on the upcoming 123 negotiations, the nuclear cooperation agreement, would have been disastrous in my mind. And so the fact that we were able, in the United States side, essentially to compromise, to back down, to be supportive of Korean positions on that one issue, I think at least sets a better environment, hopefully, for something that could have gotten much worse in the spring. So I think I would kind of put it in that context. Obviously, the key issue coming up is that we have a very narrow window, and I think the next panel, and Sharon and the others can get into this in greater detail, a very narrow panel for negotiating this nuclear cooperation agreement, because by the time we get both new administrations newly inaugurated and new people in place, you really got till June or the end of June to negotiate it, and it's a very sensitive, difficult issue in that regard. The one point I would point out for both papers, I think they gave a little bit short shrift to, was the question of Japan. I mean, Dr. Shin kind of gave a nod that yes, there's a question of precedence, but this is the question of, to use a Japanese phrase, the honne, the tatemae, right? If you're talking internally in Korea, it just chafes everyone that in 1987 or 86, whatever it was, Japan was given, the full fuel cycle abilities, and Korea doesn't have that. And so that's where it doesn't come out in public very often. But what I would actually like to see in a project like this, and particularly with great groups like EAI looking at it, is a serious, open-eyed assessment of the Japanese experience. Because my experience is today is that in Korea, all they're looking at is that question of rights, and they're not looking at questions of responsibilities. They're looking at the question of why can Japan do this rather than and why can we not? And nobody's saying, let's look at the Japanese experience. Has it been successful? Has it been economically successful? Has it been successful in terms of technologically successful? Has it been successful in terms of security? You can just go down this whole list, and I think if South Korea did a very, and if it's been successful in terms of non-proliferation, has it strengthened the regimes despite all the efforts put into it? I haven't seen that debate yet in South Korea, and it's one that I think would be very helpful in the coming months going forward. Let me move on. I realize I'm going on a bit long here quickly to talk about Dr. Braun's paper. I found this paper extremely interesting. He really dialed down into some very specific, very creative suggestions, which, as he said both in his introduction and his conclusion, are helpful in that he was able to take them out of the context of the 123 agreement renegotiation. You're saying, these are all things that we could be doing before or after, whatever. And so it helps, in my mind at least, move us away from a zero-sum mentality. Because right now, the way the debate is shaping up politically is South Korea wants to do all these wonderful things, but the U.S. will say no, right? And Dr. Braun did a pretty good job of saying, look, even outside the relatively narrow scope of a nuclear cooperation agreement, there's an awful lot going on. And there's an awful lot of possibilities that are there. At the same time, however, I'm not sure that this fully addresses the fundamental debate in South Korea. Because most things that you suggested, with the exception of maybe the trial kind of dry cask storage inside Seoul, most of them involve doing things outside, other places, investing in the U.S., doing things joint research with the U.S. Whereas, if you really get down to the nub of this, what's happened here, and I think Dr. Chun, maybe it's Sheen, I can't remember, one of the two presented it well. The previous nuclear cooperation agreement was signed 40 years ago. Korea is not the Korea of 40 years ago today, and we want respect. We've been tremendously successful on every front. We've done all these things. We're an exporter now, and we want somehow to identify that respect. And unfortunately, it's kind of dialed down to these are things that are going to have to be done by Koreans in Korea in that regard. And so I'm not so sure that they address that fundamental dynamic of confidence and fairness and respect. I would be very pleased to have, again, if I kind of wrap up with this final comment, a debate that kind of focused on I'm trying to think of a fancier word to use it, but needs or necessities, as opposed to aspirations. And so if I break it in the one hand, a lot of the issues that I've heard, and this is, again, as a relative layperson, even in a meeting that I was at earlier this week, or last week rather, focusing on kind of enrichment. On the ROK side, you've got these national aspirations, which are, again, clear and justified recognition of national accomplishments across a whole spectrum of fields that are being justified by technical needs, right? In other words, you've got national aspirations to have what Japan has, to be recognized for what you are and what you've accomplished. And so the scientific and the technical community comes in and says, well, we need enrichment, we have to guarantee some fuel supply, we have limited storage space, it's a small country, and they come up with all these kind of justifications for that. And thus far, the American non-proliferation community and the American technical community, and as far as I can tell, the U.S. government response has largely been to argue on the basis of those technical requirements, right? And to say, well, no, obviously, rather than doing enrichments, it's far more economical just to do stockpiling, and rather than to do reprocessing, it's far more economical to, just do dry cask storage or whatever. And so we've kind of responded on a very technical level without kind of addressing some of the underlying aspirational issues that are underneath that. And so, again, I realize I've kind of muddled the waddle for it, but the final statement I have on this was a a strong answer that came back at a similar meeting about a week ago, where I was asking him, essentially he was saying that because on the U.S. side in the technical community they discount the scientific or economic rationale behind the South Korean programs, it thus casts dispersion or suspicion on why South Korea is pushing in this direction on many of these areas. And as a result, South Korea should just do away with the fig leaf, right? If you want to push for these issues solely on a nationalistic, status, pride base, then do it on that basis alone. And it's, that's compelling. But as I thought about it, in a world of politics, and we live in Washington D.C., how many policies in the United States or in Japan or in Great Britain or anywhere else in the world are actually justified, solely on the technical needs? I mean, we all use fig leaves, and certainly South Korea shouldn't be deprived of them either. So, anyway, I realize it's a bit of a muddled thing, but it's an honor to be on this panel. 3 great papers, and I think it gives us a lot of food for discussion. So.
Great. Thank you, Gordon. I thought very, very useful comments as well. I think unfortunately, we have only about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. First, I'd like to ask if any of our panelists feel an immediate need to respond to anything that's been said, or should we allow the audience who've been sitting patiently to ask a few questions? So if you could just raise your hand, and then we'll bring the mics around to you. Duyan, you could introduce yourself.
Hi, Duyan Kim, Center for Arms Control Non-Proliferation. Thank you so much for all of your insightful comments and expertise. Dr. Braun, you raised an intriguing idea about the USEC idea, and my understanding, and I see the pros and cons to that, but my understanding is that Korea's KEPCO has signed an MOU with Urenco USA for investments in New Mexico. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that alignment. A separate comment that I'd like to make, and I'd like to hear all of your expert reactions to, and some of our colleagues here have heard me say this in a different presentation at a different workshop, but and that is that we need to divorce the North Korean issue from any discussions of the 1, 2, 3. For us to include North Korea in this discussion sets us up for suspicions on motive and intent, because for South Korea to demand ENR capabilities, that really hits home to what is South Korea's motivation and intention. And to discuss North Korea in that context, that immediately raises suspicions that one day a South Korea with ENR capabilities might want to make the bomb because it faces a North Korean threat. And so I would have to argue that the talking point really should be North Korea is not is not a factor of the 1, 2, 3. And what's interesting is that despite the fact that South Koreans think of North Korea at the forefront of their minds, and one place that it's not, weapons in North Korea is not in the minds is really with peaceful nuclear energy. And there is a distinct culture and education in South Korea among nuclear engineers to not think of weapons, or they weren't allowed to think of nuclear weapons. And Gordon, you raised a good point about the 91 North Joint Declaration, and yes, we all know who broke that. North Korea broke all 6 points of that. And North Korea, in an ideal scenario, if South Korea is given ENR capabilities, North Korea really has no counter-argument because it already is enriching and reprocessing and doesn't need to ask for such rights. So that is my 2 cents, and I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
I'd like to make some comments. Man Sung Im, I'll be speaking in the afternoon, but I am supposed to just talk about collaboration aspects. But I think Mr. Flake mentioned something about the context. So I thought maybe at least we need to think about that issue. In this workshop, we don't have an opportunity to talk about that context or South Korea's need while we're talking about ENR and etc. That actually is missing in this workshop, so which is sort of unfortunate. But so we cannot really talk about in details sort of the existential need of South Korea's development in some of this. I think there is a danger in framing this whole question in terms of South Korea's rise as a global power, middle power, and then crying out for the recognition and demand for trust. I think this discussion is not really for that. We can see that. And some of the reason why we're talking about non-proliferation a lot in this discussion is because the 123 agreement negotiation team, US side, is purely nuclear non-proliferation specialist. So the problem is framed as a nuclear non-proliferation problem. Whereas, as you pointed out, the problem or the whole thing rises from the South Korea's existential need. I think you mentioned something about military missile negotiation, and then eventually U.S. recognized the need for South Korea to come up with this. But again, there was a sort of an existential need out of South Korea's military defense. Many people, including the United States, didn't realize that South Korea didn't have anything against North Korean aggression. If there is something coming from North Korea, they simply cannot defend themselves, including U.S. action. So without allowing South Korea to have this missile range expansion, basically the country is vulnerable. And when they realized this, there was no other option. It was not a recognition of South Korea's need or rising stance or something. It was just existential need. And same thing with the special nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel programs, or etc. Anyway, I think we may have chance to talk about this. Going to Dr. Brown's points, I think there is already a dry storage program going on. South Korea has an experience in setting up and operating and licensing dry storage cask facility at Ulchin. So there is already expansion, the existing program. And also, as you mentioned, and I think the TerraPower's fast reactor program is already in collaboration with Kerry and KAIST and so on. So there are many of those cooperation is already taking place.
Well, thank you. I've found this this discussion both very interesting and very encouraging. I think what we've heard, in a way, reflects, the South Korean tendency to view this set of issues as an issue of recognition of what South Korea has become and achieved, and I understand that, and I think we've heard from Dr. Braun the American tendency towards practicality in dealing with these issues. Let's try to do something that makes economic and security sense. And I guess what I'm kind of looking for is a merger of those two things. I was very, very impressed with some of the things that Dr. Chun said about giving South Korea, or recognizing a much larger South Korean role in managing the regional and global nuclear regime, and somehow I'd like to see that portrayed in these negotiations as a recognition of what South Korea has become and wants to do. And I also, from what Dr. Braun said, isn't there some way that these practical ways of cooperating, new ways in some cases of cooperating, can be portrayed as recognition of what South Korea has become? And somehow, I guess my plea and appeal is, can't we find some way to introduce into the 1, 2, 3 negotiation, or the agreement itself? Since we are dealing with a new South Korean, I'm not a nuclear or a non-proliferation expert, but I've been dealing with this issue with both North and South Korea and others for many years, and somehow I think what we're hearing is greater respect for South Korea, and in fact, as Dr. Hamry said, a real American desire to see a greater South Korean role in managing this kind of issue on a regional and global, as well as bilateral basis. So my plea is, can't we find a way to portray that in both countries in ways that will help satisfy this very understandable South Korean quest for greater recognition.
me, I'm Larry Nix from CSIS. Let me direct a question specifically to Gordon, because he made the point that perhaps we should pay more attention to Japan in terms of this discussion. If you get a new U.S. ROK nuclear cooperation agreement that really does expand South Korean options with regard to the nuclear fuel cycle, to Gordon or anyone else in the panel, how do you think Japan would react to that outcome? Gordon mentioned the Japanese opposition to the agreement on missile range enlargement, and I supported that enlargement as Gordon did. But the Japanese reaction to that, I think, has taken me back a little bit, and I think we know what's behind the Japanese reaction. It's the old history-related territorial issues. So if you get a new nuclear cooperation agreement that does expand these South Korean options along the lines of what South Korea is proposing, how do you think the Japanese government will react? Is there some danger, and I know this would not be the governing factor, but is there a danger that one outcome could be a further worsening of Korea-Japan relations?
Thank you. I think with those questions, we will go back to our panel. And why don't we just go back down the line? So, Professor Chun.
Thank you. Thank you for very helpful and encouraging comments. I have 3 or 4 points I'll go through very quickly. The first one is about fairness of NPT. I think this is a very theoretical question, actually. When you talk about sovereignty and sovereign rights, in modern international relations system, sovereignty is actually socially constituted. So, sovereign rights in every case is compromised. If you're familiar with Krasner's argument about organized hypocrisy of sovereignty perspective. So there is always compromising and always negotiations about sovereign rights. So the fairness is not just about is it really fair in dealing with issues, but it is really fair in making compromising in dealing with any issues. So NPT cannot be completely fair because it reflects balance of power. It was actually older than the U.S. Korea 1 to 3 agreement. It's more than 40 years old under the Cold War environments when every state is a patron of the United States and the former Soviet Union. But now everything has changed very radically. So if we put in a bilateral 1 to 3 agreement inside the framework of NPT, then South Korea should long for the status of a better example for the future cooperation. South Korea should not long for any exceptional treatment by the United States. It will hurt not just U.S. interests but South Korean interests. So we should have a very rule-based approach. If South Korea has a very transparent measures and high level of non-proliferation efforts with having a better technology or better capacity in dealing with nuclear industry, then I think we'll have a better, prospect for mending the problems of NPT regime. So again, as Professor Ambassador said, we should long for a better example. That's actually for South Korea's interest. The second one, the revision of the NPT or South Korean roles in international institutions. Well, in relation to North Korea, we can revise, we can make efforts to revise the NPT regime. Actually, we can make some additions to NPT regime. There is some scholarly debate. We can punish some states if they withdraw from the NPT regime after the acquisition of nuclear technology. It'll be very hard. If we want to mend the NPT regime, it's like opening the Pandora's box. But there could be some efforts institutionally to amend the NPT regime. The second way is to combine NPT with a political approach. If we deal with North Korea problems, for example, we can do it from a bilateral perspective, a unilateral, six-party talks, that kind of thing. So if we combine political and institutional approach, both are possible, and U.S. and South Korea can cooperate with each other, especially in the latter case, by developing a common political approach to the North Korean nuclear problems. Alliance, very shortly, you can expand the concept of alliance itself. We are not just dealing with a military threat from North Korea, but we want to expand the scope of alliance by dealing with many issues, functional issues, also this kind of nuclear governance-related issues. So it will be very good for the purpose of the alliance. Japan, I think it's very important. We have to study. I heard from many American colleagues that Japanese experience shows that having reprocessing ability is not so economical. So we have to review that. And also, Dr. Larry Nich's question, there will be some worries about, South Korea is acquiring the position. But if we maintain a very strong relations with the United States as an ally partners, the alliance partners, and also if we enhance trilateral cooperation with Japan in the future, then we can lessen the worries of Japan in the future, and we can make some efforts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Gordon. You raised very difficult question about this. But the bottom line is, I think, whether it's a 92 declaration or 2005 agreement, we have to really make a distinction between whether this is about the nuclear weapon issue or it is about the nuclear energy issue. And what the U.S. ROK 123 agreement is about is nuclear energy issue. So I think in that sense, the both government, and in particular South Korean government, need to make sure that we are not seeking for any kind of weapon capability in any capacity. So, and also in that sense, this is not about the past, this is about the future of nuclear energy and the collaboration between the two countries. So as long as we make it very clear, in that sense, I think, yes, still South Korea is a democratic country and there are different opinions and there's like a 조선일보, article. Those kind of elements does not really help much. So, of course, there could be many different opinions, but the clear thing is whether it's the government, South Korean government, makes it clear that we have no whatsoever intention about this, politicizing or weaponizing this issue. So that maybe is a key. And even in that applies to the case of Japan. I mean, it could also work in both ways. The South Korea can say, oh, Japanese got it, so why cannot we get the same right? Or the U.S. government can say, yes, Japanese got it, but it failed completely. So why you want to have that kind of thing? But if we stick to that kind of case, again, there's no solution, I guess. So what we need to do is, this has nothing to do with Japan. This is more about U.S. Korea. And it is about, again, it's not about the past, it's about the future. And I think in that sense, it's one thing that we talk about sovereignty issue or alliance issue, but the real practical issue is about all this technology and the science. And I think in the afternoon session will be, in that sense, very important. And Mr. Choi Brown already alluded to some aspect of it. It's for one thing that for us to talk about the U.S. ROK. But when you really get down to the real practical issue of energy and science technology, I'm sure there could be many ways. The third way or the creative way for the two governments to come up with a kind of constructive solution to this problem. Thank you.
I wonder if you realized, first of all, thank you for all your comments, which are very helpful to me, and I'm very thankful. I don't know if you realize it, but when I started out to write this paper, I was given specific instruction. I was told, don't talk about the 123 agreement. It's too sensitive. We don't want to tread on the toes of the U.S. government, and we don't want to express an opinion which will tie the hands of the U.S. government one way or another. Given this instruction, I had to think, what could I do independent of the 1-2-3 agreement, which is why I got to where I got. This is not to say that I don't have some thoughts about how the 1-2 agreement should be concluded, but I'd rather keep those to myself than put it in a particular paper. As regards the aspirational issues, which are extremely important, and I quite agree with you, something should be done to recognize the achievement of the Korean nuclear industry, and as a matter of fact, the entire Korean system. When you think that 50 years ago, the country was devastated, and look where it is right now. I mean, this kind of quick recovery is almost unique in the history of the world. I cannot tell you how I felt when I was in Chongguan and I saw the Doosan heavy equipment plant, and I saw them building equipment for the American AP1000 reactors. I was involved in the AP1000 discussion almost since day one in 1985. And for me it was a paper reactor and a paper reactor and a paper reactor for 25 years, until I finally saw equipment being manufactured for this in Korea. So then I knew it was real. And I can't tell you what a good feeling it was to see that something is coming out of all these mounds of paper that I've seen in my lifetime. So, you know, aspirational issues could come into fruition. Now, what could be done more in terms of aspirational issues? Again, and bear in mind that I had to come from my starting point, and I couldn't do otherwise. There's various things. First of all, we should highlight the achievement of the Korean nuclear energy system as well as the Korean entire economic system, regardless. However, there is even some specific things that could be done. We are talking about equipment supply. Don't forget that Westinghouse supplies little things to the Korean system, like control or drive mechanisms, which are little things, and by now they could be even done by Koreans in Korea without regard to the United States. Korea supplies the big heavy things, the pressure vessels, the steam generators, which are quite complex but very big. So talking about this little thing versus these gigantic things. That's an interesting reflection on who helps what in what. And this could and should be highlighted. Another area that should be highlighted is the cooperation in pyroprocessing. Should it come to be recognized and accepted and whatever? And again, we are talking about 20 years into the future, but we are talking about LMR's technology, which is again 20 years into the future. There could be a very good synergism between the LMRs, should they ever be developed, and pyroprocessing, should it ever be commercialized. And the tie-in between these two technologies that complement each other leaves a huge room for cooperation in Korea and in the United States in developing an entire new system of reactor and its fuel cycle together in Korea and in the United States. So that's on the technical side. Another idea is the smart reactor, which is a Korean design. Actually, the reactor is American, transplanted to Korea, but the application to water desalination is a Korean application. And the value of it to the industrializing world and the less developing world, where water will become an issue, is enormous. And that's a Korean idea, which should be highlighted and should be supported by American companies, not just by Korean corporations. And even though we have now a Korean concern, it didn't achieve any sales yet, and it could be supported by the American side, as well as we are calling for various supports on the Korean side to the American system. Again, bear in mind where I started from. Finally, I want to thank you about your question about enrichment. In my paper, I mentioned also Urenco and Arriva, but I want to mention that what I'm calling for is not just a 2-3% minimal cooperation. I'm talking about cooperation now in the range of 20 or 30%. We are really talking about large equity stake. We are talking about really becoming a large junior partner. So I'm talking about taking this cooperation to the next level before proceeding eventually from there to building a plant in Korea, should everything be resolved in the 1-2-3 agreement. But as I told you, I was precluded from talking about it. And with that, I'll finish.
I realize we're over, so I'll be very brief. First, I just want to be respectfully disagreement. This question of existential needs, that's what I was trying to get at, but you are articulated it actually more effective than I do. I think that's where the root of the debate is. Those who advocate on Korea, whether it was on new missile guidelines or reprocessing or enrichment, they argue existential needs, and that's where the scientific debate is. They would argue they are not. And so, again, I wouldn't cede that. I would disagree respectfully. Ambassador Hubbard, rightfully kind of pushed us towards a vision of where we might cooperate together going forward, particularly as we deal with the difficult issues in the 123 agreement. My understanding was that was the purview of the next panel, not ours as well. So I'm happy to push that off to Chen Bong-gung and Sharon and the others who can address that in the next panel as we go forward. To me, there's this fundamental, again, you notice I like this notion of tensions between them. And I'm using words here, semantics here, but it's a question of rights versus responsibilities. Upstream versus downstream. If Korea is focused on upstream, what others have and what they want, what their aspirations are, that's very much a rights-focused debate, right? And yet, if you look at the downstream responsibilities, you're thinking about what impact does Korea's decision have on the global regime? What impact does Korea's decision have on Japan? What impact does Korea's decision have on the alliance relationship on other countries, Brazil, Turkey, whatever the countries downstream like that? And so that tension between rights and responsibilities, I think, should be at the crux of Korea's strategy going forward. And I just hope that I could articulate that a little bit better. The final question about Japan, I'm not as worried as Larry is about a negative Japanese reaction. Even the reaction to the new missile guidelines was more from the punditry than from the official line. The question I would kind of turn on its head for Korea is, in addition to assessing the success or failure of the Japanese, full fuel cycle, if I was Korea, I'd look very careful at the Japanese experience as a nuclear energy power in the global community, because they really have been a world leader in terms of safety, in terms of international standards and norms, given their own unique national historical experience with nuclear weapons themselves, on non-proliferation. And so clearly, as Korea starts thinking about aspirations, and again, here I'm going more to the responsibility side, there are tremendous lessons to be learned from Japan in that regard. And as Korea does that, depending on which direction they go, that will obviously impact how it's perceived in Japan, in Washington, and elsewhere.
Great. I think this was a fantastic start to the day. We are now going to, convene next door for lunch. But before we do, let's thank our panel for a wonderful session.